Close your eyes for a moment. Breathe in the scent of pine and cinnamon. Hear in the distance the echo of songs that speak of peace. It is an almost universal memory, a promise etched into our collective imagination. Christmas, a time when the world seems to slow down, wrapped in an unspoken truce, where differences are set aside in the name of celebration and hope. The twinkling lights in the windows do not only illuminate the streets, they try to illuminate the human soul, promising that, at least for one night, everything will be all right. It is the celebration of innocence and faith in goodness, a promise of safety, warmth, and love. But what if that promise were broken? What if behind the facade of wreaths, a darker reality were hiding? Imagine that the sound cutting through the silence of the night is not bells, but sirens. That the red staining the snow does not come from festive attire, but from something that should never be there. For most people, the idea is a sacrilege, a violation of a sacred pact. Christmas should be a sanctuary on the calendar, immune to cruelty. Yet history, recorded in forgotten files, tells us an uncomfortable truth. Evil does not take a holiday. On the contrary, sometimes it chooses this very date for its most shocking appearance. This is not fiction. These are not campfire horror tales. What we are about to explore are real events, meticulously documented, cases in which festive joy was brutally interrupted, turning homes into crime scenes. These are stories of shattered families, of presents that would never be opened, of futures stolen on the date that should symbolize renewal. Each case is a reminder that pressures, resentments, and human fragilities do not magically disappear with Christmas lights. They merely hide, waiting for the right moment to emerge, with consequences even more devastating and ironic. Throughout this journey, our goal is not merely to shock, it is to understand. We will dive into the facts, analyze reports, and uncover what leads someone to commit unthinkable acts on such a symbolic day. Is it the pressure for a perfect celebration, family tensions amplified by forced togetherness, or something deeper, an inner darkness that feeds on contrast, finding in others' light the trigger for its manifestation? We will investigate the psychology behind these crimes, searching for patterns and answers, always with the utmost respect for the victims and their stories, which deserve to be told not for the horror, but for the truth. This is an invitation to look beyond the sparkle, to question the fragile peace the date imposes on us. Together, we will unravel the stories hidden behind traditions. Stories that prove the most sacred night can, for some, turn into the most profane. This documentary is about the broken promise of Christmas, about moments when the magic dissolved and gave way to harsh reality. Prepare yourself, because the lights we are about to turn on are not those of the festive tree. They are the cold, investigative lights that will illuminate the darkest corners of human nature, precisely when we expected to find only peace. To understand how the most festive date of the year can become the stage for the unthinkable, we must first dismantle the very fantasy of Christmas. There is a well-documented psychological phenomenon known as Christmas blues, or holiday sadness. It is a brutal cognitive dissonance. The entire world tells us to be happy, grateful, and full of hope. But for many, the internal reality is one of loneliness, anxiety, or grief. This pressure to perform happiness is, in itself, a burden. It creates a social mask that, under the weight of other tensions, can crack spectacularly, revealing what truly lies beneath the polished surface of the celebrations. The obligation to feel joy can, paradoxically, be the first trigger for darkness. Added to this emotional pressure is one of the most powerful stressors of modern life: money. Christmas has become a commercial giant, a marathon of consumption where affection is often measured by the price tag. The search for the perfect gift, the preparation of a lavish dinner, decorating the house, all of this generates a financial burden that many families simply cannot bear. This monetary anxiety does not remain contained in spreadsheets. It spills into daily interactions, shortening tempers, feeding resentments, and turning small arguments about spending into bitter confrontations. The shine of shop windows hides the shadow of debt, and that shadow has the power to poison the very environment that should be peaceful. And then there is the most volatile element of all: family. The holiday acts as a catalyst, forcing gatherings in confined spaces among people bound by blood, but often divided by years of unresolved conflicts, old rivalries between siblings, grievances with parents, political or lifestyle disagreements. All are placed at the same table. The expectation of harmony prevents these tensions from being expressed in a healthy way. They simmer in silence, manifesting as passive-aggressive comments, disapproving glances, and a heavy silence that can be more deafening than any argument. The house becomes a pressure cooker of repressed emotions, waiting only for the right moment to explode. When these three factors, the pressure for happiness, financial stress, and toxic family dynamics, converge, they create what specialists call a perfect psychological storm. Add to this the consumption of alcohol, often used as social lubricant on these occasions, and the inhibitions that normally keep our darkest impulses in check begin to dissolve. A misinterpreted comment, a veiled criticism, or an old wound reopened can be the spark that ignites the emotional powder keg. In this hypersensitive environment, the line between a common family argument and an irreversible act of violence becomes dangerously thin, almost invisible. It is precisely at this breaking point where the facade of festive joy disintegrates under the weight of reality. That tragedy finds its most fertile ground. The promise of peace and love is inverted, and the home, which should be the safest refuge, becomes a crime scene. For the Covina family, in a suburb of Los Angeles, Christmas Eve of 2008 would not be marked by the exchange of gifts under the tree, but by a visit that would turn the American dream into a nightmare from which they would never awaken. The doorbell rang, and on the other side of the door was not a jolly old man, but the embodiment of all that accumulated resentment. In Covina, a quiet suburb of California, the night of December 24, 2008, was exactly as it should have been. In the Ortega family home, the air was thick with the smell of tamales and the sound of laughter. Around 25 people, grandparents, parents, children, and grandchildren, were celebrating unity and joy on Christmas Eve. The tree lights blinked, the presents were stacked, and the atmosphere was one of pure family happiness. It was a perfect portrait of Christmas peace, a sanctuary of affection and tradition, completely unaware of the darkness methodically approaching from a source they once called family. That darkness had a name: Bruce Pardo, a 45-year-old electrical engineer whose divorce from Sylvia Ortega, finalized just a week earlier, had been bitter and contentious. He felt betrayed, humiliated, and financially ruined by the settlement that forced him to pay substantial alimony. To Pardo, the Ortega family was no longer a safe harbor, but a representation of everything he had lost. Their celebration to him was an insult, a party built on the ruins of his life, and in his distorted mind, that offense could not go unanswered. It demanded a devastating response, planned with the cold precision of a predator. Pardo's response was not an act of spontaneous rage, but a work of macabre planning. In the weeks leading up to Christmas, he prepared with chilling calm. He acquired 4 semi-automatic firearms and hundreds of rounds of ammunition. In his garage, he built a grotesque device, a homemade flamethrower, pressurized and disguised as a gift-wrapped package. His escape plan was also set: a rented car, civilian clothes hidden away, and a one-way plane ticket to Canada. Every detail was meticulously calculated to inflict maximum pain and ensure his own escape. Around 11:30 p.m., the doorbell at the Ortega house rang. Amid the party, the sound brought a wave of excitement. The children, eyes shining, ran shouting that Santa Claus had arrived. And indeed, at the door stood the iconic figure, a large man dressed in a velvet Santa Claus suit with a red hat and white beard, carrying a huge present. An 8-year-old girl, Katrina, was the first to reach him, her face lit up by the magic of the moment. She opened the door for the jolly old man, not knowing she was inviting a demon into her home. The moment the door opened, the illusion shattered. Santa Claus's smile was a mask for the fury burning beneath. With a swift motion, he drew a pistol from inside the suit. The first person he aimed at was little Katrina, who had greeted him with such joy. The deafening sound of the first shot ripped through the Christmas night, replacing carols and laughter with the echo of absolute terror. The party was over. The Covina massacre was just beginning, and the man in the red hat was its harbinger. The knock at the door was answered by Katrina, his 8-year-old niece, excited to see Santa Claus. For an instant, the illusion held. But the sack Bruce Pardo carried did not contain gifts. With a quick movement, he drew a semi-automatic pistol. The girl's smile froze. Her scream of terror was the spark for chaos. Pardo then revealed a second object, a large, grotesquely wrapped package concealing a homemade flamethrower. Christmas music was still playing, a bizarre soundtrack as fantasy disintegrated into nightmare. The first shot rang out, and the Ortega family's celebration became the stage for an execution. Panic exploded. The 25 guests plunged into a frenzy of survival. Plates fell, glasses shattered, and screams overlapped, creating a cacophony of terror. Pardo moved with chilling calm, a predator in his territory. At first he did not aim at specific targets. The goal was disorientation. He fired into the crowd as people desperately tried to find cover behind sofas or under tables, running toward exits that would soon be blocked. His ex-wife, Sylvia, and her parents, Joseph and Alicia, were the primary targets. But in the chaos, everyone became a victim of a fury that made no distinctions. After the initial barrage, Pardo activated the climax of his plan. The wrapped package was a compression sprayer filled with a gasoline mixture. He raised it and began spraying the flammable liquid throughout the living room, soaking the carpet, the curtains, the Christmas tree, and the presents. The chemical stench of gasoline overwhelmed the pine scent of the dinner, a harbinger of destruction. For a second of terrifying silence, the only sound was the liquid being expelled. Then, with a click, he activated the ignition device, a propane torch attached to the sprayer's nozzle. The house erupted in flames. It was not a slow fire, it was a detonation of fire. The living room, filled with synthetic decorations, instantly turned into a furnace. The tree lights burst and the plastic ornaments melted, releasing thick, toxic black smoke. The intense heat shattered windows, feeding the flames with oxygen. For those inside, the situation became unbearable. Fleeing from bullets turned into a race against asphyxiation and burns. Some jumped from second-story windows, preferring broken bones to being consumed by fire. The house, symbol of family, was being transformed into a funeral pyre. Amid the inferno he created, Pardo began his retreat. Chaos was his cover. As victims screamed and the fire consumed the structure, he stripped off the Santa Claus suit, now stained, abandoning it on the lawn like the discarded skin of a monster. He changed clothes, got into his getaway car, and vanished into the darkness of the night. For the first responders, the scene was apocalyptic. A house engulfed in flames, injured survivors stumbling outside, and the silence of those who did not escape. The murderous Santa Claus had disappeared, leaving behind only death, ashes, and a terrifying question. Where did he go? As sirens cut through the Covina night, Bruce Pardo sped away from the hell he had created. The adrenaline of vengeance surged, but an unbearable pain began to overtake it. The acrid smell of burned plastic and flesh filled the car. The homemade flamethrower, his tool of destruction, had turned against him. In the chaos, fuel splashed, and the synthetic Santa suit, his disguise, fused to his skin in a deadly embrace. The hunter became a human torch, and his escape was not a triumphant act, but a desperate race against agony his plan had never anticipated. The burns were third degree, severe, incapacitating. The skin on his arms was a blackened mass of pain, making every turn of the steering wheel torture. This was the unforeseen factor, the chaotic variable that unraveled his perfect equation. The grand escape plan, driving hundreds of miles and disappearing, was now an impossible fantasy. He could barely think, let alone pilot the plane waiting for him. His body, the vehicle of his freedom, had betrayed him. Physical pain mirrored the implosion of his plan. The perfect revenge and clean escape dissolved. Disoriented and in agony, Pardo changed course. The border was out of reach. There was only one last refuge, his brother's house. He arrived in the early morning hours, not as a conqueror, but as a pathetic and defeated figure. Inside the quiet, sleeping house, he tried to tend to his wounds, but it was useless. The damage was too extensive. The following hours were a silent purgatory. Alone, surrounded by the suburban normalcy he had just destroyed for others, Pardo confronted the dead end he had reached. His great act of power had left him powerless and utterly alone. When Christmas morning dawned, police were already on their way. But there was no confrontation. Bruce Pardo had made his final decision. Inside the house, they found him dead, the victim of a single gunshot wound. The scene, however, revealed the extent of his failure. Strapped to his body with plastic wrap was $17,000 in cash. In the car, a plane ticket to Canada and a fake passport. His plan was never just murder. It was escape and rebirth. He intended to erase his old life in fire and begin another. In the end, the only life he managed to erase was his own. The case of Bruce Pardo is a study in resentment taken to the extreme. A man who, feeling wronged, chose to become a monster to annihilate the happiness he could no longer have. His story is a grim reminder of how bitterness can rot the soul, turning a neighbor into an agent of chaos. He was an external force that invaded a home. But what if the monster doesn't need to knock? What if the danger doesn't come from outside, but already lives within the walls, sharing meals and secrets? There are tragedies that do not explode in flames, but are built in silence, until love itself becomes the weapon of the crime. But not all Christmas horror is planned with the cold precision of a resentful engineer. Sometimes it grows from the soil, silent and ancient, from within the walls of the very house meant to be a refuge. To find this more intimate and perhaps more disturbing form of tragedy, we travel back in time to 1929. The place is Germantown, North Carolina, a rural community where life was dictated by the sun and the seasons. The Great Depression had not yet shown its cruelest face, but poverty was a constant companion for families like the Lawsons. They were tenant farmers, working tobacco land they did not own, trapped in an endless cycle of planting, tending, and harvesting, only to hand over most of the profit to the landowner. It was a life of hard work, few rewards, and simple faith that today's labor would ensure tomorrow's survival. At the center of this family stood the patriarch, Charlie Lawson. At 43, he was a man shaped by the land, strong, taciturn, and, to most neighbors, an industrious worker and decent family man. Beside him was his wife, Fanny, 37, who had already given him 7 children and faced the hardships of rural life with quiet resilience. Together, they managed a house full of life, noise, and the obligations that came with a large family and little money. Charlie was the provider, the final authority, a man whose word was law within his modest wooden house. He was the axis around which the lives of his wife and 7 children revolved, a constant and dominant presence that defined the rhythm of their days and the nature of their dreams. The children were the beating heart of the farm. Arthur, the eldest, at 16, was already a grown man in terms of labor, helping his father in the fields. Then came the daughters, the beautiful Marie, 17, Carrie, 12, and little Maybelle, 7, and the younger boys, James, 4, and Raymond, 2. The youngest was baby Mary Lou, just 4 months old. Their lives were not filled with play or school, but with responsibilities. From an early age, they learned to toil in the tobacco harvest, care for animals, and help with household chores. It was a life stripped of luxuries, where a new pair of shoes was an event and a sweet was a rare treasure. They were a unit of labor, each member playing a role in the daily struggle for subsistence, unaware of the darkness gathering beneath the roof of their own home. And then, just weeks before Christmas of 1929, Charlie Lawson did something extraordinarily out of character. He gathered his entire family, spent money they could barely afford on new clothes for everyone, and took them to the city of Winston-Salem. The purpose of this costly and rare trip was not a fair or a visit to relatives, but a photography studio. For a family of tenant farmers, a formal family portrait was an almost unthinkable extravagance, a luxury reserved for wealthy landowners. Yet Charlie insisted. There they stood before the camera, stiff in their new clothes with solemn expressions. The resulting photograph is eerily formal, a glimpse of a family trying to project an image of respectability and unity. That image, forever captured, was not a record of a happy moment or a celebration of achievement. It was an epitaph. It was their last act as a whole, intact family. The portrait, with its serious faces and eyes that seemed to stare beyond the lens, would become the macabre symbol of the tragedy that would unfold days later. The photograph did not capture the life of the Lawson family. It froze it at the exact moment before annihilation. What could drive a father, a provider, to commit such a costly and unusual act just days before destroying everything he built? Was the photograph a trophy, a confession, or a final act of distorted pride? We want to know your opinion. Leave your initial theory in the comments below before we continue. The morning of December 25, 1929, began with deceptive quiet on the Lawson farm. The North Carolina air was cold and biting, and a thin layer of snow covered the ground, muffling the sounds of the world. Inside the house, Christmas excitement was palpable, especially for the older daughters, Carrie, 12, and Maybelle, 7. They had just put on their new dresses, bought during that fateful city trip, and were preparing for a walk to their uncle's house to play with their cousins. Charlie Lawson watched his daughters, his face an indecipherable mask. He instructed them to begin the walk, an apparently normal act of a father on a holiday morning. Nothing in his behavior suggested it would be the last sunrise his daughters would ever see. As the two girls walked down the path leading away from the property, the morning silence was shattered. Charlie was waiting, hidden near the large tobacco barn. He was no longer the father who had watched them leave moments earlier. He was a hunter, and his prey was his own flesh and blood. The first blast from his 12-gauge shotgun echoed through the valley. Maybelle fell first. Carrie, in an act of indescribable panic and horror, screamed and tried to flee, but there was nowhere to run. Another shot sealed her fate. Charlie did not pause to contemplate what he had done. With methodical coldness, he dragged the small bodies into the barn, positioning them carefully, as if arranging broken dolls, placing stones under their heads. Outside, the snow began to be stained, not only by violence, but by incomprehensible betrayal. With his older daughters dead, Charlie returned to the house. His wife, Fanny, was on the porch. Perhaps alerted by the gunshots she might have mistaken for hunters. What transpired between them at that moment is one of the most debated and darkest points of the case. Did she confront him? Did she suspect the evil he had just committed? The answer was a single, brutal, point-blank shot. If you believe Charlie's strange behavior in the days before had already raised suspicions in Fanny, leave a like on this video, and comment below which sign you think was the most alarming. Fanny's death on the porch marked the transition from horror hidden in the barn to a declared massacre inside the home he was meant to protect. The interior of the house, which should have been a sanctuary of Christmas joy, became the next stage of terror. Charlie moved with frightening efficiency. He found and killed his sons James, 4, and Raymond, 2, as they tried to hide. With each shot, silence returned, heavier and more oppressive than before. The final act of cruelty was the most devastating. In her crib, little Mary Lou, just 4 months old, was beaten to death. There was no hesitation, no apparent remorse. It was the systematic annihilation of his lineage, carried out with a calm that defies all logic and human morality. In a matter of minutes, the Lawson family home became a silent mausoleum. When the last sound of violence ceased, a deep, unnatural silence settled over the property. Charlie Lawson was now the only living being in the house, surrounded by the bodies of his wife and 4 of his children. The only survivor, his eldest son, Arthur, 16, had been sent by Charlie on an errand to town earlier that morning, an act of mercy or a lapse in his macabre plan. Charlie now walked through the house, a ghost amid his own creation of death. The family portrait hanging on the wall now seemed a cruel mockery, a record of lives he himself had extinguished. With the deed done, a single overwhelming question hung in the icy winter air, a question that would echo for decades. Why? When the snow stopped falling over the fields of Germantown, silence gave way to questions. The crime was undeniable. The perpetrator, Charlie Lawson, as well. But the question that echoed was a single torturous syllable. Why? Authorities, overwhelmed by a brutality the community had never imagined, launched an investigation that would delve not into evidence, but into the dark recesses of the human psyche and family secrets. The Lawson house, once a symbol of labor, became a sealed crime scene, a monument to incomprehensible tragedy, where every object seemed to hold a clue. Initially, the simplest explanation pointed to financial pressure. The Great Depression loomed, and the idea of a father driven to despair by poverty was a comprehensible narrative. However, this theory quickly unraveled. Charlie Lawson was a respected worker, and although not wealthy, the Lawsons were not on the brink of destitution. He had savings, the farm was productive, and there were no crushing debts. Neighbors and relatives were unanimous. Charlie's problems were not financial. The search for motive had to go beyond money and into the soul of the family. Then the whispers began, transforming into the most persistent and disturbing theory. A secret so dark it would explain the need for total erasure. An alleged incestuous relationship between Charlie and his eldest daughter, Marie. Rumors, never proven, fueled by third-party accounts, suggested Marie was pregnant by her own father. Under this lens, the Christmas shopping trip was not a celebration, but an attempt to calm a situation about to explode. The violence, therefore, would not be sudden madness, but a final solution to prevent his most heinous secret from coming to light. The psychology behind a family annihilator is complex. Such acts are rarely impulsive. They are the climax of internal pressure tied to a sense of failure and distorted control. For Charlie, annihilating his family may have been the only way to control the narrative, to erase the shame he believed would be his ruin. By killing everyone, he not only silenced witnesses, but destroyed the very legacy he had corrupted. It was an act of supreme selfishness, a final violent attempt to exert power over a destiny he himself had poisoned. In the end, the official investigation was inconclusive. Without a confession or definitive proof, Charlie Lawson's motive was buried with him. The incest theory, though never confirmed, became the unofficial truth, the only explanation that matched the scale of the atrocity. The case was closed but not resolved, leaving the community scarred and stories whispered in low voices. Yet one final detail persisted, a mystery within the mystery that investigators never deciphered, suggesting the story had not truly reached its end. We leave behind the grim certainty of a crime and enter the fog of a mystery that never lifted. It is Christmas Eve, 1945, in Fayetteville, West Virginia. The war is over, and a fragile optimism hangs in the cold air. Here lives the Sodder family, George, Jenny, and 9 of their children. That night, 5 of the older children, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, begged to stay up a little longer. Their parents agreed and went upstairs to sleep, leaving them playing. The night promised the tranquility of a family holiday, a peace about to be irrevocably destroyed. Shortly after midnight, Jenny was awakened by the telephone. An unfamiliar voice asked for someone who did not live there. Jenny dismissed it as a wrong number and went back to sleep. An hour later, she awoke to the smell of smoke. George's office was on fire. Panic was immediate. She screamed, waking George and the others. The wooden house became a deadly trap as flames spread at terrifying speed. The main hallway was already a wall of fire, separating the parents from the stairs leading to the attic, where 5 of their children slept. George, Jenny, and 4 of the children escaped into the cold night. But Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty were still trapped upstairs. Terror set in when they realized the attic staircase was engulfed in flames. Desperate, George ran outside, planning to use his ladder to reach the attic window. He always kept it leaning against the side of the house. But when he reached the spot, the ladder was gone, simply vanished. Amid the chaos of the fire, the first piece of a sinister, inexplicable puzzle fell into place. Hope faded with each passing second. George's backup plan was to park one of his trucks against the house to use it as a platform. He ran to the vehicles, which had worked perfectly the day before. But that night, neither would start. It was as if an invisible force thwarted every rescue attempt. Meanwhile, attempts to call the fire department failed. The house's phone line was dead. A neighbor tried from a nearby phone, without success. Every door to help seemed mysteriously closed, leaving the Sodder family alone to witness the horror. By dawn, the Sodder house was a smoldering pit. Firefighters, who arrived 7 hours later, conducted a superficial search. The conclusion was swift and devastating. The 5 children were completely incinerated. The official explanation was that the fire reached a temperature high enough to disintegrate the bodies, including the bones. But to Jenny Sodder, the logic made no sense. How could a house fire erase 5 children from existence without leaving a single tooth, a single bone fragment? A terrible realization began to take shape. Perhaps her children had not died in the fire. As Christmas morning sunlight revealed the devastation, what remained of the Sodder home was a smoking shell. The official investigation began almost immediately, but its superficiality planted the first seed of doubt. Fire Chief F.J. Morris spent only a few hours at the site before declaring his theory: faulty wiring caused the fire. For authorities, it was a tragic but simple case. A hasty conclusion that ignored the disturbing details George and Jenny could not forget. The official narrative was being written, but for the parents, the most important pages were blank. Within days, the conclusion was formalized. The coroner convened a jury that deliberated for less than an hour before issuing death certificates for Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty. Cause of death: fire or suffocation. The explanation for the absence of bodies was that the fire, fueled by wood and coal, reached such extreme temperatures that it completely incinerated the bodies. For the law and the community of Fayetteville, the tragedy was sealed. 5 children had perished in a terrible accident. The case was closed, and the Sodder family was left to mourn a loss their hearts refused to accept. George Sodder could not accept it. He knew fire. He knew that even in cremation furnaces, human bones do not completely disappear. They persist. He began his own investigation, questioning a crematorium employee who confirmed his suspicions. A house fire lasting less than an hour could never generate enough heat to obliterate 5 skeletons. Where were the skulls, the spines, any fragment proving his children had been there? The absence of evidence was not proof of annihilation. To George, it was proof they were not there. The doubt over remains was only the beginning. There was the ladder. George always kept a long ladder leaning against the side of the house beneath the attic windows, a clear escape route. On the night of the fire, in his desperation, he ran to get it, but it was gone. Days later, it was found not fallen, but deliberately thrown into a ravine more than 60 feet away. Who would move it, and why? The removal of the only external escape route did not seem coincidental. It seemed like calculated sabotage, another piece of a far more sinister puzzle. Then there was the phone line. When Jenny tried to call the fire department, the phone was dead. Initially, they assumed the fire had burned the line. But a phone company worker made a chilling discovery. The wire had not burned. It had been cut, cleanly and intentionally, at the top of the pole. The missing ladder, the cut phone line, the absence of remains, the pieces did not fit an accident narrative. For George and Jenny, the conclusion was different. Terrible and hopeful. The fire was not an accident meant to kill their children. It was a distraction to take them. Convinced of a conspiracy, George and Jenny Sodder refused to let official silence be the final chapter. They saw official inaction not as a dead end, but as a call to action. In 1947, after an appeal to the FBI was rejected due to jurisdictional issues, the family made the decision that would define the rest of their lives. They would finance the search themselves. They hired private investigator C.C. Tinsley, a tenacious man with one mission: to unearth the truth police seemed determined to keep buried. Tinsley delved deep into the maze of secrets and rumors in Fayetteville, uncovering disturbing facts ignored by the official investigation. Months before the fire, an insurance salesman, furious over George's criticism of Mussolini, threatened that his house would go up in smoke and his children would be destroyed. Shockingly, this same man was selected for the coroner's jury that hastily ruled the fire an accident. Tinsley also heard reports from witnesses who saw a suspicious man watching the children from a car for weeks, strengthening the suspicion of a premeditated kidnapping. In 1952, frustrated by the lack of progress, the Sodders erected their most enduring and poignant appeal. Along the busy Route 16, they installed a giant billboard. Black and white photos of Morris, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty stared out at the road, above a reward that would reach $10,000 for any information. The billboard was more than an advertisement. It was a monument to unyielding hope and a silent accusation against a justice system that had failed them. It became a somber landmark, a daily reminder of the mystery. The search consumed the family's existence. George and Jenny followed every lead, no matter how improbable, traveling across the country in response to reported sightings. The house, never rebuilt, gave way to a memorial garden for the lost children. Jenny, in a grief that never ended, wore black for the rest of her life, tending the garden with near religious devotion, as if expecting her children to return home at any moment. Hope was a flame that refused to go out, even as it burned the family's soul. The billboard remained on Route 16 for more than 35 years. George Sodder died in 1969, convinced until the end that his children were alive. Jenny continued the search alone, adding a fence and lighting so her children's faces would never fade into darkness. Only with her death in 1989 was the billboard finally removed. The last surviving daughter, Sylvia, maintained her parents' belief until her own death. The billboard is gone, but the questions it asked remain, forever etched into the landscape and memory of West Virginia. The ashes in the Sodder family fireplace cooled long ago, but the chill they left behind remains. It is a chill that transcends a single tragedy, echoing across decades and settling into other homes on other Christmas nights. What unites the faded billboard on Route 16, a 6-year-old girl's beauty pageant crown in Colorado, and the charred remains of a party in Covina is not just the date on the calendar. It is the violation of a sanctuary. Christmas is sold as a truce, a moment when the world collectively agrees to be kind, to believe in the best of humanity. These stories are brutal proof that this truce is, at best, fragile, and at worst, a complete illusion. Each of these cases is a grim reminder that darkness does not take vacations. The facade of twinkling lights and cheerful carols often hides the same tensions, resentments, and capacity for violence that exist on any other day of the year. Perhaps it is precisely this contrast that makes these crimes so disturbing. They do not happen in a dark, anonymous alley. They erupt in the heart of the home, at the epicenter of celebration, turning symbols of joy into scenes of horror. The Christmas tree, beneath which presents should gather, becomes a silent witness to a nightmare. Peace on earth becomes a cruel irony, whispered over police tape. The Sodder family's search for their children was a search for answers that never came. The mystery of John Benet Ramsey's murder remains an open wound in the public conscience. Bruce Pardo's carnage in Covina raises the terrifying question of how little we truly know those we love. In each story, the true horror does not end with the final act of violence. It continues in the silence that follows, a silence filled with unanswered questions, suspicions that corrode families and communities, and the deafening absence of those who were taken. These are the questions that haunt us, that keep us awake at night long after the Christmas decorations are put away. So what do we learn when we look at these empty fireplaces? We learn that safety is a construct, that normalcy can be shattered in an instant, and that pain respects no holidays. The memory of these victims demands more than shock or fleeting sadness. It demands that we acknowledge the uncomfortable complexity of human nature. Behind every door adorned with a wreath, there is a story, and not all stories have a happy ending. The hope of Christmas is real, but so is its fragility. Snow can cover many things, but it cannot erase the stains tragedy leaves behind. These stories do not end when the credits roll. They survive in the questions we continue to ask and in our refusal to let the victims become mere footnotes to a holiday. If you, like us, believe some questions deserve to be asked until they are answered, subscribe to our channel and join the search. The truth often hides in the deepest shadows, and there are many more shadows we still need to explore together. Click the video now appearing on your screen to uncover the next mystery, a case that will challenge everything you think you know about justice.